It took a while for this to start, so I'm in the middle of eating a grape. All right, welcome back to Words of Wisdom from Dr. Hidalgo. For many of us, school has started, so I thought instead of talking about things that I suggest doing to prep you for school, I would now start talking about things that are going to help you be successful in school. So, the stupid mistake that I made that I'm trying to help you avoid making is I studied in a way that was emphasizing putting stuff in my brain instead of in a way that was pulling stuff out of my brain. And so most of what we've learned in high school is with the intent of what I and many educators term sort of a binge and purge, which is putting things in short term memory, and you are just going to let them know what you have learned in a very quick fashion, and you're not going to utilize that material again in any way. And this is really creating short term memory tactics that are really helpful and useful for lower level types of education like high school, but become less useful as you move up in your education. And so, through your undergraduate career, and if you decide to move on to higher education or do something like medicine, this type of low level learning, meaning that you are not asked really to integrate concepts and weave concepts together in any way, just memorize things, say what you have memorized, never use that stuff again, and move on. Whereas in college, if you just get an undergraduate degree, you're going to be studying some sort of discipline, and a lot of the material that you're learning in the classes as you advance through your undergraduate career are going to require you to consolidate these concepts, integrate these concepts together, analyze these concepts, evaluate new things, and start to do some sort of type of creation, which are higher level of thinking. And they require different study tactics. So, another mistake that I made was thinking that studying and learning were the same thing, and they are not. Studying is the tools that you use to learn material. And short term memory, neuroscience has shown, is really just electrochemical sort of stimuli that occurs. And when this electrochemical stimuli stops, you don't no longer remember anything. And we all experience this. We study a bunch of words, and then we take our test on our spelling test or whatever it happens to be, and we don't think about those words again, and we can't really remember how to spell a lot of them anymore because there's this rapid decay of knowledge because it hasn't been ingrained into our long-term memory. And our long-term memory, it's been shown through neuroscience, is actually a way of changing the physiology of our brain, where our nerve connections are now reorganized in a way that allows us to have long-term memory, integrate concepts together, and sort of advance our understanding in the ways that things connect to each other, not just in what they are on a surface type of way. So there are several sort of techniques which are used in order to, instead of put information into our brain, to pull information out of our brain. And there are some trends that tend to exist with students who are high level learners. And what I'm going to suggest first off is that probably a lot of the tools that you have used are ones that I am going to strongly suggest that you get rid of. And these tools would be things like rereading your textbook or reading your textbook in great detail, highlighting a lot of things, and summarizing, having a big summary page. These are some of the most common study tools that students use, and they are actually the least effective and some that take the most time. And so I am dyslexic. So there are things that I did, like rewrite my notes, that some people who really study and teach learning suggest that you don't do altogether, but I still found those to be really helpful. So I think that it's good that I'm a scientist. I have a chemistry degree and I now specialize in education, because really you should consider learning to be an experiment. So there are certain trends that great learners tend to do, but the techniques that you use within these trends are vast. And some of them are very effective for some people, and some of them are not very effective for others. So I am in this video just going to give a little bit of an overview of the things that I suggest you start doing now that I've told you what I think that you should stop doing. And there are really 5 different there's really three different trends that I find students who are really good learners tend to use. One of them is pre-studying. Another is the sort of way that they engage with the material. And then the rest are revisions or the review of the material itself. So I think what people really need to understand is that learning is messy. Learning is not linear, and learning is progressive. And there are periods of time that we want to take advantage of that will really help our brain process information in a way that will be incredibly effective towards answering exam questions properly. So for example, if you're somebody who has sat in an exam and said to yourself, I have no idea where to get started, that's because you are not challenging and increasing your cognitive load and really using your brain the way it should in terms of learning in order for it to make those neurological connections and say to itself, well, I have this information, I need to answer this question, and so I need to take these steps in order to get there. And that is really going to be the main purpose behind challenging yourself through some very effective active studying strategies that can greatly increase your learning. And a lot of times students feel as though confusion is bad. So if I'm confused while I'm studying, if I'm really struggling with the material, this must not be very effective, or I don't know anything. And so I need to go back down to a different layer where I'm no longer struggling as much. And this confusion or this struggling is actually where your brain is making the connections that it needs to make and where the learning is happening. And so although the brain is an organ, I really like to think of it as a muscle. And it's been shown through decades of cognitive psychology that you can strengthen your brain the same way you strengthen your muscles within your body. And this is called cognitive load. So the amount of confusion that you can put into your brain is something that you can increase with time and get to a point where you will find that you are not studying any longer, or maybe even for shorter periods of time, but you are more effective in your assessments or your exams. And so I think all of us have heard, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so I really relate this whole thing. I like to lift weights, so I'm doing a lifting, studying type of analysis. And if I was to go into the gym and lift 2-pound weights, I am not going to see any change in my strength or in my physique because I am not challenging my muscles in any way. I need to get in there and I need to struggle underneath some heavy weight in order for me to make any gains. And this is the exact same thing when it comes to your brain. If you do not struggle while you are studying and don't allow yourself to sit with a bunch of confusion, you are never going to make the cognitive gains that are important, especially if you want to do something in a higher level education, become a doctor, get your PhD. Those sorts of degrees are going to require you to be able to handle some cognitive load and make some connections and get comfortable being uncomfortable with this idea of confusion instead of strain when you're lifting. So for myself, when I squat, I have a sticking point. And I know that when I get past this sticking point, if I just stick with it long enough and struggle hard enough, if I can get past that, I'm going to get that bar all the way up. And this is the same idea with learning, but this is what we tend to call the aha moment or the light bulb moment. And these are actually termed threshold concepts. So the types of tools that I'm going to sort of start briefly introducing you to, and some of which I really strongly suggest that you implement starting right away with your studies, are meant to help you get past these threshold and understand these threshold concepts quicker, have your moment of your moment of clarity faster, so that you're able to really integrate the ideas and be incredibly successful academically. So the first thing that I really suggest is you're always constantly thinking about the big picture. So a lot of times when we read a textbook, we're reading that textbook and we're trying to fill in the details and we're trying to understand like the itty bitty little bits that go with everything, when it's actually a lot more effective if you read the textbook in a broader sense and sort of try to get an idea of, okay, what is the big picture? How do these concepts start to relate to each other? And now through your studies, or what I'm going to term revisions, is when you are going to start filling in those details for yourself, but always keeping in mind the big picture. So you really want to ask yourself a ton of questions. Again, what I did was I tried to put stuff in my brain, but what I should have been doing sooner was pulling stuff out of my brain. And it seems really counterintuitive, but we've all heard practice like you play. Like if I'm going to play in a soccer game, I'm not going to practice basketball. Or if I want to be aggressive in a soccer game, I'm not going to be really laid back in my practices. And the same is true while you're studying. On an exam, you are asked to recall material and collaborate ideas to come up with an answer. However, for some reason, when we study, we tend to try to shove stuff into our brain, but we need to be practicing pulling it out of our brain. And it is incredibly challenging because we do not know the material yet. And so we are going to be struggling with seeing, well, what do I know about this? How does it connect with what I learned yesterday? Where does this fit in the big picture of things? And so asking yourself these questions constantly is highly effective in your actual learning. And it's really difficult. And you are going to find that you can't answer a lot of those questions right away. And this is fine, because this is going to allow you to see, well, these are the concepts and the connections I don't know yet. So I really want to sit down and purposefully look at these things and think about how they connect with everything. And these are the things that I really understand and can pull and recall quickly. So I'm not going to worry too much about those. And on my next revision, I'm going to go through these and make sure that I'm able to interweave them with all of the information that I'm still trying to wrestle with. So keeping in mind that the first thing you want to do is really do this sort of broad-based reading. What are the main concepts? How do they come together with each other? Let me see if I can get a general idea of the overall idea of what it is that I am trying to learn. And then start asking yourself, and I suggest too that you write these questions down. There are educators and learning professionals who do not suggest rewriting lecture notes. I am not one of them. I found rewriting my lecture notes was highly effective. And I did, in fact, highlight, but I wouldn't highlight the way I see a lot of students highlighting, which is color coding and highlighting these big sentences and doing all this stuff. I would highlight individual words that were the main concept ideas. And I would try to really see how I could get these words to connect with each other in a way that was very helpful to me in understanding how things went together and what the big picture was, and how we could understand how all these concepts came together to help us answer a very broad-based question. And this is allowing your brain to use a lot of the different parts of it and start to make a lot of different connections that you are going to need to use when you're looking at a question and need to say, well, I'm given this information and I need to find this. So how do I need to get there? So I suggest, and I've seen some medical students, in fact, have just pages and pages and pages of just questions, and not low-lying questions like, what is this and what is that? But higher level thinking questions. How does this work? How do these relate to each other? Where does this fit into the big picture? How come this does this the way it does? And where does this relate to everything else? So notice that these questions are really forcing connections to be made with the material, which is very, very challenging, but also very effective in our learning process. So again, learning, not linear, messy, and progressive. So you are going to continue to revise or look over and review these questions through what is termed spaced repetition. But the ability for you to answer these questions will dictate how much time you spend in between looking at these topics, or the amount of space in between your revisions or repetitions. So spaced repetition. And so this is really what's been termed active learning. You are actively recalling and asking yourself to answer questions without looking at your notes. So that's something that I didn't say. I want you to close your book and answer these questions. So as you're rewriting your notes or as you're doing things, write down a bunch of questions. And when you go back to studying for that class, answer those questions first thing. And where your answers come into play is going to help you decide how you are going to use that time that you have to study for that class with the most amount of purpose. So active recall, closing your book and bringing out of your mind everything that you can remember. Spaced repetition, reviewing the material. So within one study session, you want to space out your revision or your repetition of the concepts that you were struggling with in the beginning, but the amount of space that you spend in between reviewing concepts that you find quite easy can be until the next study session or 2 or 3 study sessions, depending on how easy it is for you to recall that information. And then the third real important thing here is this idea of interweaving. So you are going to want to interweave your concepts with each other. So practice a little bit of this, go to the next chapter, bring it back over here. How does it relate to this? And you want to be bouncing around all that material as much as you possibly can, interweaving the concepts with each other. And in one of my previous videos, I talked about the Pomodoro effect, where if you study for 25 minutes, you take a 5-minute break, study for another focused 25 minutes. And I think this is a really effective thing for some students to do and something you might want to experiment with, where maybe you have a 2-hour block of time to study. For the first 25 minutes, you're going to study chemistry, 5-minute break. Next 25 minutes, you're going to look at your math, 5-minute break. Next 25 minutes, you're going to look at your biology, 5-minute break, and then go back to your math, go back to your chemistry, go back to your biology. So you're interweaving all those concepts in, forcing your brain to come back to this recall fashion and really putting some cognitive strain on it and forcing it to work for yourself. And this will be a very effective way for you to be able to integrate all of these concepts in, as well as see how they tie together and start really putting that material into your brain. Other things that I highly recommend are keeping your notes closed. So maybe you're about to sit down and study for a class. Don't look at your notes at all. Just start to write down everything that you remember from the lecture or whatever you've learned for that duration of the semester. And I also suggest that if you haven't heard of what I like to call a spider map, that's my favorite term for it, but it's also known as a mind map or a concept map. These are nonlinear ways to create notes that are very effective towards your brain making all these connections for itself. So instead of sitting down and just writing down in paragraph form or in bulleted form everything that you can remember from the class, try to write it in a concept map type of way or a spider map type of way where you're remembering and forcing yourself to recall all the material, but you're also forcing yourself to see how everything connects to itself. And after you write down everything you can remember, then go back to your lecture notes in your book and fill in what you didn't include or what you forgot. And I recommend that you do that in a different color pen, because that is where you're going to want to sit down and spend the time with your material. And then the other thing that I also recommend is not spending too much time writing a bunch of stuff down, but seeing if that you can write it in as few words as possible, which is really going to be a test in how well do you understand the material. Typically, the more wordy you are, the less you actually understand it. And if you're able to create diagrams other than these sort of mind maps, but maybe pictorially represented in some way, you're forcing your brain to work in a bunch of the different hemispheres that they're called, which is going to really start to integrate material in there and have some long-term memory occur. And I really recommend self-testing yourself as much as possible. And I always tell my students, if you want to fail a class, what you want to do is look at a problem, say you don't know how to answer it, go to the solutions manual, and then you tell yourself, oh yeah, no, I know how to do that, and you move on. If you cannot do it without looking, you do not know it. So don't do that to yourself. That is the best way to fail any of your classes, is to use that technique. So force yourself to think about it. Force yourself to come up with some sort of answer. And what you'll find is that some things you know, so you don't need to worry about studying those. You can space your repetition of those concepts out for long periods of time. Some things you just have no idea where to start. And this is where you need to start piecing together, well, what do I know about this? How does it all relate? Why does this do this? That sort of thing, and piecing together the components of the big picture. And then there will be problems where you can start it, but you always get stuck and everything kind of falls apart at the end. And then this is where I am confused with the material, so this is where I'm going to spend my time. So if you are someone who passively studies, it feels good to rewrite a bunch of notes and to do a bunch of reading and look at all this stuff that we did, but it's not actually good for learning. You are studying, and it makes us feel good because we spend a lot of time doing stuff that's academically related, but it's honestly, a lot of it is just a giant waste of time. And so if you start at these higher levels of thinking, you'll find that your brain fills in all these details for you. And you have now gotten rid of taking detailed notes from the book and reading the book through and through and all of that sort of stuff. But it takes a lot of time to learn these techniques and to be able to do them well. And there's a lot of different techniques within these types of revisions that I'm talking about, and a lot of different types of mind maps that you can create. So it's really worth experimenting and seeing, well, which of these really work well for me. So I really strongly suggest, if there's nothing else that you do right away with your studies, the first thing that you do is start creating a list of questions for yourself that are how and why questions that you are going to force yourself to try to answer without looking at the notes when you first start studying. And then use your answers to those questions as a guide towards how you're going to spend the rest of your time. So try to do as much active recall as possible. The other thing that I recommend, and what I talked about in one of my other videos about scheduling, is the amount of time that you wait to study is actually shown to be like really important. So for example, if you have class on Monday, you should really study for that class on Monday. Sit down, don't look at your notes, write down everything that you can remember from that lecture, try to create some sort of mind map of it, go back to your notes, see what you forgot about, and then fill in all of those gaps, always asking yourself, how does all of this fit into the big picture? How do these connect with each other? And then what's going to happen is your brain at night, if you do it for the same day, is going to do what's called sleep-dependent memory consolidation, which is essentially your brain working for you at night to put all these pieces together. It's kind of a very layman's way of putting it, but essentially you're studying while you sleep. And it's highly effective. But if you have class on Monday and you don't review for that class until Tuesday, you are not going to have the opportunity to have your brain do all this work for you overnight. So it's really important. And what I suggest is, if you have the hour after your class to study for it right away. Write down everything you remember from the lecture, start asking yourself a bunch of questions, start answering all those questions, creating a mind map from your brain, and then go back and see where you need to fill in all of the blanks. Then your brain is going to start putting all of that together for you that night. So I highly recommend you do that. And if you cannot do it right after your class, make sure you do it the day of your class. These are what I call natural study breaks, very effective ways to help your mind not lose everything that you just learned. And it turns out that if you do this, you have a huge benefit from the sleeping. And I am going to do one of these on sleep because sleep is hugely important. It's kind of the Miracle-Gro for your brain. But your brain makes a lot of connections while you're sleeping, does a lot of the work for you while you're sleeping, and it also really works at getting rid of things while you're sleeping. So if you ever wonder, like, why is it that when someone asks me where I parked, I know where I parked today, and I'm not remembering where I parked last week and finding myself in the wrong spot? That's because as you sleep, your brain's ditching that memory of where you parked last week so it can remember where you parked today, so you're able to get back to your car. So there's so much that's going on in your brain while you're sleeping, and it is so important that you prioritize sleep and able to be academically successful. So do some pre-learning before you walk into lecture. If you have somebody who just lectures to you for the whole 50 minutes, ask yourself questions throughout the duration of that lecture. How does this correspond with what they were just talking about? Why does that work the way it does? And try to keep yourself actively engaged in the material while it is being presented to you. Do a revision that same day. Close your notes. What is everything you remember that was talked about in the lecture? Write all of it down. How do all of these things connect to each other? Then open your notes and see what you left out, and then spend the rest of your time studying those things that you left out and making all of those connections for yourself. And then continue to do these revisions. And keep in mind too, I said that learning is very messy. And what I mean by that is, textbooks and lectures tend to be presented in a very linear fashion because this is kind of the easiest way to explain it. But for you, it might not be the way that you really make sense of the material. So I might talk about things in my lecture, A, B, C, and D, or you read it in a textbook, A, B, C, and D. But then when you sit down, well, it's way easier for me to think about it like B, D, A, C. That's how my brain really is able to understand and grasp this material. And so allow for yourself to have this messiness in your learning, which is why just sort of reading your book with getting an idea of what the main topics are and then filling in those details as you're thinking about how everything corresponds to each other is a much higher level of studying that is going to allow learning to happen in a much quicker fashion, especially if every time you sit down and revise your understanding of the material, you're doing it in the same way, where you're pulling the information out of your brain to see what you actually know, making the connections, and then allowing your struggle to increase that cognitive load so that your brain is working and building as a muscle and changing that physiology between all of the neurons and the nerves within there. And continue to do this and continue to do this, because again, it is a progressive thing. And eventually it will be in your long-term memory. You're going to look at an exam question and it doesn't matter what the instructor is asking you or what direction the instructor is asking you to think about it in, because you've already done that. Your brain has already done those and made those connections. And so you'll be able to say, I have this information, I need that, and I'm going to get there by doing all of these things. And it will be a much better way for you to study. But again, it's a process. It's not easy. It can be very difficult. I know for myself, when I was sitting there feeling that I was so stupid because I didn't understand anything, it didn't feel productive, when in fact, it was the most productive way for me to study. And it has been proven over decades of research that it is the most effective way for you to increase your cognitive capability, your cognitive load, and your ability to understand things. And the one thing that I will also say is that if there was another thing that I could do differently, it would be to read this Make It Stick book. I think mostly instructors read this, but this book is written for the student. So if you are starting off in college and you are interested in being academically successful, I highly recommend that you read this book or listen to podcasts by these authors, because this is hugely revolutionary in the way that you are going to approach your studies. And I wish I had read this as a freshman. So Make It Stick, Peter C. Brown. The other one is Benedict Carey, How We Learn. This book is also really awesome, and it will change the way you think about studying. And it'll make you really realize that the process of learning is spectacular, and there's a lot to learn about it. And it's not what we've kind of been led to believe is the way we are supposed to study and learn. So we have been taught what to learn. We have never been taught how to learn. And these are the first steps that I recommend you start taking and experimenting with in your learning process. And you'll be surprised once you've nailed a bunch of these down and gotten rid of things that are time consuming, that you'll realize I'm not studying anymore. I'm actually maybe even studying for less amount of time, and I'm doing significantly better on my exams. So I really highly suggest that you start sort of rethinking the way you're studying. If you're doing those very traditional, rereading the textbooks, highlighting a bunch of stuff, writing a bunch of linear notes, stop putting stuff in your brain, start pulling stuff out of your brain. Start off your study sessions by writing down everything that you can remember, and from there, plan the rest of your study session. I'm going to have more lives that get into more detail about the techniques of some of these or different things you can try within each of these trends, because there is so much out there. I could talk for 5 hours about mind maps in and of themselves, the different types, how you can utilize them, how you can make them. But nobody's going to watch this video if I spend this much time talking about that stuff. So I'm going to do it in little chunks, but I hope this gives you an idea of how you can approach your studies, especially if you're a freshman in college just getting going, that will really revolutionize your learning experience. Don't skip the struggle. Allow the confusion to sit. A lot of my students are like, I feel like I don't know anything anymore, so I just quit. That I don't feel like I know anything anymore is right before everything starts coming together for you. So ride the wave. It's definitely worth it.